I should say to start out that, as some of you may know, we do an annual housing affordability survey, an international housing affordability survey. We rate housing affordability in the last year 159 largest markets in the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, and Ireland. We will be publishing probably by February 1, and I hope we'll find some additional urban areas to include. And it's been very effective this year so far. Since the publication of our third product, we've had about 350,000 downloads, which is about double what we had last year. But in any event, I want to talk to you about a project we're working on that will be finalized somewhere around the first of the year. What it is an attempt to take a good hard look at some markets, metropolitan markets around the country, with respect to housing prices and the components of those housing prices and the trends. It is an 8-market analysis, and I'll describe it to you. 4 of the markets being so-called smart growth markets. And by the way, I include in smart growth places like Boston, Washington, New York, where they rely largely on large lot or rural zoning, something, by the way, that the costs of sprawl, which Randall and I have both referred to as one of the principal strategies of smart growth, despite the fact that many of the smart growth people would like you to believe they are not strategies of smart growth. The biggest problem with smart growth is the way that it rations land and drives up prices. Doesn't matter whether you ration land like Portland or the United Kingdom and don't allow development to go out very far, or whether you basically force all development to take more space than the market would normally allow, so there's no land to develop either. So anyway, trying to get along here. Basically what we did was to go into these 8 markets and try to identify the elements of price in each of the markets, both with respect to new housing and existing houses. We did that basically by looking at factors like the RS means construction indexes, how housing construction costs vary from urban area to urban area, and that kind of thing. And we looked also at a time analysis. But this is a chart that shows the median multiple in the 50 largest markets in the United States. The median multiple being the median house price divided by the median household income. It is an indicator that was first put out for international comparisons by both the World Bank and the United Nations, so it is the principal indicator of housing affordability. And the great advantage about the median multiple is it is not one of these situations where interest rates have a role. Interest rates are very important, of course, with respect to housing affordability, but this is a measure of structural housing affordability. Interest rates may drop to 3% or they may go to 12%, but the fact is once a house gets to $600,000, chances are it's not going down. But this shows you a huge distribution of housing affordability in the United States. Notice many of the markets remain under the historical standard, I should say the historical maximum of 3. San Jose is close to 10. Los Angeles is 11, the most unaffordable place in the Anglosphere that we can find at this point. So the issue we were looking at is, does smart growth lead to materially higher housing costs than occur in non-smart growth markets? Because the smart growth advocates claim that smart growth correctly applied does not raise housing prices. Of course, you're going to see that it does, but probably because it's improperly applied, sort of like communism was improperly applied, if you know what I mean. In any event, and I want to make sure you all know, our houses here are a marvelous suburb of Kansas City and a house that could only be forced by regulation in Portland. So the 8 markets that we're dealing with, the terms I use are responsive planning, in other words, responsive to the market, and prescriptive planning, where you're going by visions and plans, and it's actually the planner's preferences. The 4 responsive markets being Atlanta, Dallas, Fort Worth, Indianapolis, Kansas City, and the 4 prescriptive markets being Boston, Portland, San Diego, Washington. So, surprisingly, and this is something that's coming out with changing migration trends, actually the prescriptive markets are growing slower than the responsive markets. Indianapolis is growing faster than San Diego by a long shot at this point, and it has to do with housing affordability. Let's look, first of all, at the existing house prices. This is what we did is we said, okay, let's look at the elements of cost. Let's look at structure replacement value with respect to median prices. Well, look at that. You look at the 8 markets, there's not much difference. There's no question that it costs more to build in San Diego than it costs to build in Dallas-Fort Worth. And the reason, by the way, I'm using this scale of 700,000, you'll see later, because the highest price houses among these markets is 700,000. Difference in structural replacement cost is minimal. What we did is we said, let us go in and try to identify a market level that represents the maximum that could be attributed to market forces other than regulation. Issues like land cost, replacement cost, etc. We basically took the median multiple of 3. 93% of the individual cases over the last 25 years in the 25 non-smart growth markets, the median multiple has been below 3. So we said, okay, 3 sounds like a good number. Anything above that we will call regulatory excess. I don't care whether it's urban growth boundaries, impact fees, planning delays, whatever is above that, we're calling regulatory excess. Here is your median prices. This is in 2006. Look at that. We've got median prices in the responsive markets ranging from 150 to perhaps 175 and up to 600,000 in the prescriptive markets. And by the way, you're going to find Portland does pretty well in all this. There are 2 reasons for that. One is that housing affordability, as bad as it is in Portland, is much better than California, so it's a good place to move from California. And secondly, about a third to a quarter of the Portland market is in the state of Washington, where they don't have the same kind of policies. And that has an impact on the market. Now, what we do is look at the trend from 1996. Look at what has happened to housing prices. Our 4 prescriptive markets have had an explosion of housing prices. Our 4 responsive markets, not much at all. This is in real terms, real inflation-adjusted terms. Remember, I mentioned the market upper limit. In other words, our attempt to identify what the market should be. The green indicates in 2006 what the market should be. Anything above that green indicates regulatory excess. And you notice that all of our responsive markets are below the market upper limit. All of our prescriptive markets are above. We can see that in 1996, things weren't so bad at all. Now, my thesis is this. Probably it is a matter of demand, though demand does not drive housing prices in the where there is sufficient supply. We have a lot of people out there that talk about what I would call the law of demand. Demand doesn't raise prices by itself, only when there are restrictions on supply. And what's happened, of course, in the last 10 years, you've had the more liberal lending markets, et cetera. Well, these prescriptive planning policies have not been capable of responding with the supply that the responsive markets do. So what you see, if you go back to 1996, a fairly small regulatory excess, that is an amount over the market price, in the prescriptive markets, and look what happens by 2006. So that 98% of the difference in the increase in house prices between our 4 prescriptive markets and our 4 responsive markets is regulatory excess. Only 2% can be attributed to market issues. The whole idea that demand drives prices up should be put aside by this slide, which shows you that the highest demands are generally in the markets with the responsive planning, and the house prices have not gone up nearly as much there as otherwise. Now, in the new housing, we wanted to look at new housing because then we could really look at the factors of production. What we find, again, is that if we look at structure costs, and what we did is we took a prototypical starter 1,600 square foot house on the urban fringe, because that's where we have built for the last 50 years the new housing in the United States for the most part. Notice again, structure costs, not a lot of differences. It costs more to build in San Diego than Dallas-Fort Worth, but not that much. We look at land finishing costs, including the purchase price and a 5 times premium to the farmer we buy the land from. What do we get? Not very much money difference. Then we look at the market, and what we did there is we basically said, let's take these factors of production and add a 20% factor and say anything above 20%, because that's the difference between the 2.5 median multiple normal and the 3 maximum. Anything above 20% is going to be regulatory excess. And you notice that the production price of housing everywhere we looked at is below our market limit. You cannot tell me that San Diego's $600,000 price of a house has anything to do with production costs compared to the $110,000 or $120,000 in Indianapolis or Dallas-Fort Worth. Again, our market estimate, notice that the market limit in green is way below the house prices in the 4 prescriptive markets and of course the responsive markets are below. And of course we get back to regulatory excess being very large again in the prescriptive markets. So let's talk, finishing up here sort of, about the negative externalities of smart growth. We've got to start talking, I think, in those terms, because the other side just loves to talk about negative externalities of everything. And let me tell you, smart growth has incredible negative externalities. Look at the components of the price differences between smart growth markets and prescriptive markets. Again, recognize, I'm not saying housing shouldn't cost more in San Diego and Boston than it does in Indianapolis and Dallas, Fort Worth. We can measure that to some extent. Not much difference in 1996, huge difference in 2006, and with respect to the new housing, which is related in terms of, there is a relationship between new and existing house prices. And remember, this is a starter house, not a classy house, as it were. Again, a huge difference. The share of the price difference used to be only about 50%, 60%. Now it's in the range of 85%. This is what regulation has done to us. You can see what's happened to the median multiple in the prescriptive planning markets. About half of the big metropolitan areas in the United States have prescriptive planning. You can see what's happened to the median multiple. They were always higher than the responsive markets, but look at the explosion that has occurred since 2006. So that you go back to 1996, for example, you see that almost all of the markets, or certainly two-thirds of the markets, are under 3. The worst market was barely 5. And today we've got all sorts of markets in the 7 to 10 and 11 category. So this is not demand, and this is not production, it is regulation. Or we can go to California, and I would urge any of you who haven't read Bill Fischel's book on regulatory takings to look at his chapter on housing in California, which is, I think, by far the best expose of what has gone wrong with California housing prices. But the fact is, California housing prices have always been a little bit above national prices. And notice they were a little bit above national ratios as late as 1970. But look at what happens after that, and then again, look at what happens beginning in 2000. So we now have a distribution that looks like this. You see our red line, our red dots there are the prescriptive markets. Our blue dots are the responsive markets. So you can see a very close correlation. The one little red that's down there among the responsives is Nashville. And as Randall indicated, Tennessee has not had the kind of housing cost explosion that has happened in other smart growth markets. A very simple reason. The same reason Portland didn't have housing cost explosions in the first 15 years of its urban growth boundary. The fact is the urban growth boundaries are set so far out, thank God, in Tennessee that it's not having much impact on the market. And hopefully the authorities down there will keep moving them out, at least as far as the state borders, so that they won't have that kind of impact. So that, let us talk about some real strange stuff here. This is, I think, perhaps one of the most important conclusion, and I apologize because of the limits of time. I actually realized as I was sitting up here that I used the wrong series of data. I did 2 series of data in the report we're working on. One is to compare the increase in housing costs, including interest, over 10 years in each of the markets, and the other is to compare the housing costs in the prescriptive markets to the responsive markets, including interest. The numbers are very similar, but the one I included here is a comparison between the markets. Now, let's think about this. If you are to, if you were to move from the average prescriptive market to the average responsive market in this country, and buy the median priced house, you will save $646,000 over a 30-year fixed-year mortgage rate. That is an amount of money that may have some impact on behavior. Let's look at Boston, where I call this the relocation bonus, but if we look at just the increase in the last 10 years, the numbers aren't much different. The relocation bonus in Boston, for almost $600,000. Now that is equal to almost 11 years of median household income. You think that's not going to have an impact? Well, we'll show you that it is already. We can go to Portland. Now Portland again is doing better because of all sorts of strange things that give it some advantages having to do with the terrible California market, but still $300,000, it's enough money that if you dropped it on the floor you'd pick it up. So again, here 5 years of 5 years. Now the real champion is San Diego, and you know, my favorite line that I ever wrote was the last line of an op-ed in the San Diego Union Tribune about 6 months ago when I said, "Welcome to the Rust Belt, San Diego," and we'll talk about the migration in San Diego in just a minute. Relocation bonus on average $1 million between San Diego and the average prescriptive market. Huge amount of money. Again, that is 18 years of median household income. That's got to have some impact. I don't know what impact, but it's got to make a difference in the long run. Now, Washington, things are pretty bad, too, about $645,000. That's Washington, D.C., 11 years of income. Now, what we have here is a situation where we look at the number of additional years required based upon just the change over 10 years. Look at that. San Diego, almost 18. L.A., about 15. These are additional years of income that have been virtually stolen by the planning process from households in these communities. And again, it is having an impact. An impact that is just absolutely unbelievable. Look at this among our 8 markets. All of our responsive markets are gaining domestic migrants. A domestic migrant is somebody who moves from one county to another in the United States. Does not include immigration or international immigration. Look at this. Boston down almost 300,000. Portland gaining for the reasons that I told you, though mind you, 80% of the gain in Portland is outside the urban growth boundary, as we would call that voting with your feet. San Diego down 120,000. Even Washington, D.C., probably having domestic outward migration since probably George Washington's last birthday party. The rates, again, pretty significant. Boston, huge. San Diego, huge, etc. Now, by the way, this is not in the 8 markets, but I want you to be aware. Within the last 6 years, now, by the way, those numbers are 6-year numbers. 2000 to 2006, they are directly from U.S. Census Bureau estimates. Within the last 6 years, nearly 4 million people have moved out of the most expensive markets in the United States to less expensive markets. 930,000 have moved out of L.A. and Orange County, which has been a dynamo of growth for 60 to 70 years and even before that. 100,000 out of San Diego at this point. So many out of San Diego that both the number and the rate of domestic migration is greater than that of Pittsburgh, Cleveland, or Buffalo. Welcome to the Rust Belt, San Diego. Let's talk about the Bay Area. They're doing much better. They only lost 700,000. Now, in fairness, let me make sure you're aware that a lot of those people who left those coastal areas are staying in California. A number have moved to the Central Valley, Stockton, Modesto, Fresno. 400,000 have moved to the Riverside, San Bernardino area, but a net 1 million people have left the state of California in 6 years. It's no better in the East, where we have seen, in addition to the nearly 300,000 who have left the Boston area, we have seen 1.4 million people leave the New York City metropolitan area between Pike County, Pennsylvania, and Montauk Point, Long Island. A huge drop. Give you an idea how bad it is. Virtually all of the states of the East are unaffordable except for Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has lost 20,000 people, domestic migrants, in 6 years. Its neighbors have lost 1.9 million. And anybody that goes to Pike County, Pennsylvania, or eastern Pennsylvania, and for that matter, York County in southern Pennsylvania, will see the impact of the people that are escaping the expensive New York and Washington, D.C. markets. So, as I mentioned, domestic migration to Portland, yes, indeed, Portland's doing well, and 80% of the domestic migration to Portland is to areas outside the urban growth boundary. This is just a slide on the San Diego Rust Belt situation. You can see the huge percentage loss that is occurring in San Diego. But my basic point is, this is a big deal. And I don't know what's going to happen. But let me tell you, it should be of great concern to people in New York and Boston and Washington and California. It's not good. And we already see that people are voting with their feet. I mean, this is an amazing situation. You think about the fact that virtually all, most of the growth that has occurred in this country since World War II has been in the South and the West. Unbelievable, the migration that has occurred. It is turning around at this point. Not out of the South. Texas and Georgia are doing fine. Florida is beyond the pale. It's losing. Allied Van Lines and United say that there is now domestic outmigration from Florida. The Census Bureau hasn't picked it up yet, but housing prices in Florida for the same reason have absolutely exploded, and it's in terrible shape. But the point is, we are seeing some real interesting things going on, and anybody concerned about the economic future of a place like the state of California needs to start recognizing that this is going to have some impact. Again, I don't know what, but it will have some impact. Anyway, thank you very much.